Hi, my name is Shani, and welcome to the Experienced Designers podcast, where we explore the human experience, what it is, and how we might create better ones for ourselves and for others. A team where you swallow conflict to keep the peace and quietly talk behind people's backs. Have you been in one of those? What about teams with high levels of distrust, defensiveness, and open disagreement? What if I told you the two are just as bad, and that healthy collaboration isn't about avoiding conflict, but about dealing with it in ways that benefit both relationship and outcomes? This is what Jim Tamm and myself discuss. Jim is a former judge and an expert in building collaborative workplace environments, teaching radical collaboration at places like Stockholm School of Economics, NASA, and the University of California. We explore what is required for us to really succeed in working together and in working through our differences. And we talk about the radical responsibility required, both by us as people and by corporations, to create and maintain the conditions for radical collaboration. Welcome to the Experienced Designers, Jim.
Thank you. It's good to be here, Shani.
Yeah, I'm really happy that you agreed to come on and and share some of your knowledge. So we kind of met by proxy in previous workplace when we were working with the team and leadership development, and I always found the work that you do really fascinating. So I want to maybe let you tell the story of that a little, because what I know of you, you spent a long career as a judge, and somewhere around kind of early 2000, you made a pivot or an evolution into working with radical collaboration.
Right.
So
Well,
I'm really curious what brought that about.
actually, the pivot was much earlier. Um,
Mm.
it looks like it was in 2000, but actually, in the 25 years that I was a judge, I was dealing with employment disputes for mostly collective bargaining disputes. So it was highly conflicted issues in the workplace, and I enjoyed I love being a judge actually, and writing decisions and holding hearings and everything. But the work that I was most proud of was the settlement work that I did, the mediation of trying to help the parties work something out themselves, because people always underestimate the damage that happens when you litigate something, or it's such a crapshoot sometimes. Nobody really knows exactly how it's going to turn out. So I always felt that the parties were always significantly, farther ahead if they could work out their own settlement. So I did a lot of that. And in fact, I believe that I've mediated more school district labor disputes or labor strikes than anybody else in the United States. So I had a lot of experience, trying to build collaborative relationships from parties that were warring with each other and at conflict. And that was throughout my 25 years. But I think because I was successful at that and liked it and did a lot of it, I was asked to take part in a special project that was funded by the state of California and the Hewlett Foundation and the Stewart Foundations, where we were trying to work with parties who were very adversarial and not very effective at collaboration, to try to teach them how to be more effective at collaboration. Because we found in the state agency that I worked for, we kept seeing the same people over and over and over again. And we were trying to figure out how come some organizations were so adversarial and so conflicted, uh, and other organizations seemed to be fine, and we never saw them, because these conflicted organizations were costing the state of California a huge amount of money, not so much in judges' salaries and courtrooms and things like that, but primarily in lost productivity. So a small group of us got together within the state. We got this big grant to do a lot of research. We did a huge amount of research. And then based on that research, we put together a pilot project to go out and try to teach the more adversarial, conflicted organizations how to be more effective at collaboration. And we were just wildly successful. I mean, beyond our dreams. We reduced the amount of measurable conflict, things like the number of unfair labor practice charges or the request for mediators or fact finders, things where we had really accurate records for a period of 20 years. We reduced that by almost 70% in almost 100 different organizations over a 3.5 year period.
Wow.
This saved the state of California so much money that the state legislature created a nonprofit foundation to keep offering it in the public sector in California. The trust went up. The number of people who said they had high trust in their work relationships went up by 50%. And it just had such a powerful impact that we kept offering it. We revised it depending upon what the situation was, the parties that we were working with. But eventually, we started offering it internationally. That was the precursor of radical collaboration. That's where the radical collaboration program came from. And then we finally ended up with, we've got like 3 different international studies over a long period of time that show that the participants that are good at collaboration, that have these skills, increase their ability to get their interests met anytime they got into a conflict by over 30%. Now, for most of us, that would make a big difference in the quality of our life. So this was going on, way back before 2000. And then eventually, after I'd been a judge there for quite a while, the state of California was in deep trouble financially. So they were looking for people to retire. So I took an early retirement and went out and started teaching in some programs. I teach at the Leadership Academy at the University of California, taught in Santa Clara University Law School for a while, taught in the Talent Development Program at Harvard, and teach in the International Management Program at the Stockholm School of Economics in their executive education program. So now I'm working in a more global situation. When I'm not teaching, I'm usually working with large multinational organizations in their high-end leadership stuff, teaching them these collaborative skills. So, that's a story of how I moved from dealing with conflict into dealing with collaboration, basically.
Yeah, it also sounds like the answer to conflict, or the antidote to conflict, is collaboration, by the way you
Yeah.
tell it.
Well, and what we found over the years was that nobody really wants to deal with conflict. When we first started this program, we called it the Radical Collaboration Program. We called it Beyond Conflict, and then we realized when I wrote the Radical Collaboration book that really people don't want to deal with conflict, but everybody wants to be better at collaboration. So instead of making it what you don't want, we made it what you do want, and changed the training in that direction more. And it's just has spread all over the world. So Sweden is sort of the hotbed for radical collaboration right now. We have more trainers active in Sweden than probably the rest of the world combined.
Wow. Yeah, I can imagine. It's a very consensus-driven culture, so I would imagine that people desire that skill, maybe
Yeah,
even more than in other
yeah.
places.
Well, and I think that effective collaboration not only helps the parties that are involved in that, but it has huge ripple effects in the community and in the organizations. The last school strike that I mediated, this went on for 5 weeks. We had 52,000 kids out on the street for 5 weeks. It became about this close to a race riot. It was a really ugly situation. And if we can go into those situations and we can teach the unions and management people how to resolve their differences in a more effective way without doing that kind of damage to the community, it not only helps their lives. I mean, their lives are significantly improved when they're not out on strike or when management doesn't have to deal with that, but they're also modeling for their kids. So then you got 50,000 kids who see a different way to resolve their differences. So then when they go home and they're angry at their parents or their siblings, they don't start slugging their siblings. Maybe they'll talk it out. They realize we don't have to fight when we have some differences. So we
Mm.
see the improvement for the teachers union and the managers, but then we also see it for the kids. We also see it for the families of the kids and the neighbors of the kids, and it just spreads like this. So it's very rewarding to see that kind of happening. It happens in organizations where we see the impact on teams, but then it spreads through the organization, and then it spreads through the business network and the organization's relationship with their clients or with their suppliers. So it is rewarding.
I can imagine. I'm just really curious to dig in also, because one of the big questions that I sit with is, so what does it look like when it's good for people?
Yeah.
And of course, like, conflict occurs, right? We're humans, we're different, we have different points of view, and we're bound to disagree from time to time. So I also don't think it's necessarily about there not being any conflict, but more about how we're actually managing with it. I would love to hear a little bit more about kind of what you see and what you know and teach in terms of,
Yeah.
yeah, what is it that works?
Well, effective collaboration is like motor oil in a car. It just makes things run smoother. And if you have that effective collaboration, everything runs better. And if you don't have it, everything runs worse. It's like if you're running out of motor oil in a car, the parts start grinding together, and then people keep replacing the parts, thinking that that's the problem, but it isn't. It's that they don't have the ability to stay in that smooth relationship. And we see this in all kinds of situations. If you look at what the hot topics are these days, like in the tech world, if you look at all of the agile skills and programs that are going on, they're all based on effective collaboration, on building trust. It's like you can't move fast if you don't have that effective collaboration, if you don't have that trust. In design work, you don't have creativity if people can't collaborate together. In sustainability with organizations, I mean, they used to just look at the profitability of an organization to value the company. But now they're even coming up with reporting requirements and things like that. They also look at the ecological impacts and the relationship impacts, the social impacts, and the governance issues. So they might look at the profitability, but they also look at the carbon emissions, and they also look at how engaged employees are or how transparent the governance is. You can't do that if people aren't effective at collaboration. You just can't make those improvements or solve those kinds of problems if you aren't skilled. So maybe it would be helpful now for me to talk about just what those skills are, because what we saw in looking back on it is that there are 5 skills that we believe are absolutely essential if what you want to do is resolve conflict or build a more collaborative environment, or if you simply want to get better at building interpersonal relationships yourself. And they're both a skill set and a mindset. They're a set of competencies and a set of attitudes. And they're competencies that are pretty practical. It's not something that takes years to learn. You can learn this stuff pretty quickly. It's all pretty practical stuff. The first one we call collaborative intention. And this is more the mindset. The skill is to be able to be focused, stay focused on mutual gains in your relationship when you hit one of those speed bumps in the road. When somebody makes a mistake or does something that you don't understand, can you get curious or do you get furious? And paying attention to what your attitude is, whether you have this collaborative intention, can it make a big impact just doing that if you don't do anything else? In the international management program at the Stockholm School of Economics, where I've been teaching for 20 years or so, they used to have to do a class project every year. And several years ago, they took on a class project about the impact that attitude has. And these were all international managers from all around the world, wherever they were, at several times during the day. They had to note down in a little notebook whether they had a collaborative attitude or whether they had an attitude that was more adversarial or conflict avoidant. They didn't have to do anything about it to change it at all. They just had to note it down. Just be aware of it and note it down. Then they collected all this data that they collected over a long period and analyzed it. And what they realized was at the beginning of the exercise, when they were collecting the data, more often than not, the majority of people fell into this adversarial or conflict avoidant type of pattern. By the time they got to the end of the project, more often than not, most of the participants were operating in a significantly more collaborative way, simply because they were paying attention. So, whenever I'm working with a group, I always say one of the things that you need to start doing is paying attention to what your own attitude is, because that, whatever your attitude is, that's going to be the, step number one in the direction that you're going. So that's the first skill, collaborative intention. The second one is openness. There's just been a lot of research showing that one of the more important things you can do is improve the level of openness within an organization to make it more effective in an organization or a relationship. A lot of the research was done by one of my mentors, a fellow named Will Schutz, in the military. But the most recent research has been done by Google, where everybody knows Google is one of the most data-driven companies in the world. And Google realized some time ago that almost all of their work in the future is going to be done by teams. And so it was really important for them to figure out, how do we set up high-performing teams as opposed to low-performing teams. And so they studied very intently for several years 180 of their own teams, both high-performing and low-performing, to see what the factors were. And if you could think of something, they measured it. They looked at the age differences, the gender balances, the types of degrees they had. They looked at things like whether the employees went to lunch together. Did they socialize, go on vacation together? Everything they looked at. Then they analyzed it. And what they realized when they were looking back on it was that almost every single thing that they were looking at, you could do just as good a job picking a team by throwing a dart at a dartboard. It just had no impact at all. They had the same thing on the high-performing teams and the low-performing teams. But there was one thing far and above everything else that was present on every single high-performing team, and that was something called a very high level of psychological safety, meaning it was an environment where people felt safe enough to raise difficult issues and deal with them directly. So anything you can do to improve the openness within the organization is generally going to be helpful. The third skill we call self-accountability, and this is people paying attention to the choices that they're making on a daily basis. A lot of times people in organizations feel they don't have much choice. The boss tells them what to do and they have to do it. But a lot of times people confuse difficult choices with no choice. It's like, no, I can't leave this marriage because I have kids. Well, yeah, you can leave the marriage because you have kids. People do it all the time. It's a difficult choice. It's a painful choice, but it is a choice. And so if we get people to start thinking anytime they get into a difficult situation that they might actually have more choice than they think they do, that can be very empowering to not only the individual, but the organization. Then, of course, the second part of that is making people be aware of and responsible for and accountable for the consequences, both intended and unintended, of the choices that they're making. So if we're working with an organization that is very high on self-accountability and choice, they're recognizing that they're allowing the situation to exist or they make some changes on it. Those organizations tend to be very low on whining and sniveling and complaining because they don't like something, they'll change it, do something about it. The fourth skill is self-awareness. And the biggest things that we try to get people to focus on there is their own defensiveness. Because in my 50 plus years of helping people and organizations try to build better relationships, there is nothing that I've seen that will help them more than better managing their own defensiveness. I've seen defensiveness undermine more people in management roles or leadership roles than anything else. We get fearful and we screw up the situation when we get defensive. In my role as a judge for 25 years or so, I almost never had to deal with pure legal issues. People were almost always before me because somebody would start feeling fearful and vulnerable, and then they would get defensive. And when we get defensive, our thinking becomes rigid, our IQ drops about 20 points, and we simply become stupid. And, not only are we terrible at solving problems then, but we tend to invite everybody else in the room to get defensive then. And then you have a whole room filled of defensive people who are just
Mm.
terrible at solving problems.
Mm.
So, helping people work with their defensiveness is just such an absolute key to effective collaboration. And then the fifth skill is negotiating and problem solving. And in any situation, especially ongoing working situations or close interpersonal relationships, there's bound to be some conflict. If you're in a long-term working relationship and you don't have any conflict there, it's probably not as productive a relationship as it could be. So what we're trying to do is help people figure out how they can deal with that conflict in a way that supports the relationship rather than undermines the relationship, because there is going to be conflict there unless you're in complete denial or overly medicated or just not paying attention. You're going to see that conflict. So it's good to be able to negotiate your way through that conflict. Now, one of the mistakes that we made, or at least that I made when we first started out, was when we went out to road test this, we went out looking for the organizations that were the most screwed up, dysfunctional, highly conflicted organizations we could find. And I thought, since they had so much conflict, that if we simply taught them how to negotiate their way through that conflict, that ought to solve the problem. But what we learned over the years was that we could teach people the best negotiating process in the world. And if they came to the table with a bad attitude or they got defensive when they were at the table, they would screw up any system we could teach them. So over the years, we've had to almost reverse the amount of time we spend teaching. And so it's the ability to stay, with that collaborative mindset, have that collaborative intention, and create that open, safe environment, and be aware of the decisions and the choices that you're making, and not get defensive. It's those skills that make the negotiating work. It looks
Mm.
like everything's being solved through the negotiations, but it's those other skills that make the negotiations work.
Mm.
And then we find that organizations that are high in those skills, they're significantly better at just about everything. They're more creative. Employees have more engagement. There's lower turnover. It just goes on and on and on. The list is immense there. So it helps everything.
Mm. I love what you're saying,
Hmm?
where we're in a space kind of looking at how do we redesign the space of the workplace to be more conducive to the human in it.
Yeah, yeah.
And what I'm finding is very similar to what you're saying is exactly this, that there are lots of tools and lots of skill sets that we can teach people, but if
Mm-hmm.
we're not different when we come to the table, if we're not coming in with these different mindsets and different attitudes, we're not capable of producing different outcomes because we're the same.
Yeah.
So there has to always be that desire, right? To actually want to learn and change and evolve from within.
Effective collaboration, we found, always starts with the individual.
Mm.
We see some organizations that will tell a group of people, all right, you're a team now, so we want you to collaborate and work together. But it doesn't work that way. You can't just dictate that you're going to have a team working together. It has to start with the individual having that intention to be collaborative, to work together, to put the organization goals, a little higher than maybe some of their own individual interests, to work together like that. And then it spreads from the individual to maybe the team or the working relationship, and then out into the organization and out into the world like that. But if you don't have people that are skilled and have the right attitude, individuals that are skilled with the right attitude, uh, collaboration won't work. It's not something that you can impose on a team,
No, and it's not a toolbox, right? As you're saying, it's this combination of the two things. So
right?
if you're only giving them the tools, but you're not creating that motivation from within, then there is no movement.
Yeah. I mean, you could have an individual with the absolute best attitude in the world, and if they don't have a clue how to negotiate their way through conflict or talk to somebody else, or if they're not good listeners, they're simply not going to be effective, you know.
Mm,
Or you can have people who have a lot of negotiating skills and they have no intention of collaborating. You know, they're not going to be effective at collaboration either. So you got to have
mm.
both.
I'm just thinking also because you brought up defensiveness.
Oh yeah,
And and a lot of the things that you're also bringing up here are about actually looking at yourself, being self-aware. How do people respond to that? Because that can also bring about a lot of defensiveness in people just being faced with this kind
yeah.
of need to improve.
Yeah, we always start off talking about how we're gonna work on defensiveness, deal with defensiveness, and everybody assumes we're talking about how to make the other person less defensive, and, and then we always circle back and say, no, 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 we're going to be talking about how you're going to deal with your own defensiveness. You know, how you can spot it at an earlier point in the process, and then what you can do about it. You know, and people kind of grumble, and you know, it's not as much fun to have to deal with your own defensiveness. But that's where the effectiveness is. If you can deal with your own defensiveness, there's nothing that's going to help you more, I think. So, first, what we do is we try to help people better understand what defensiveness is about. It is always about fear. It's fear based. When we start feeling vulnerable, what we're trying to do when we get defensive is we're trying to avoid feeling that fear. And most people think that when we're getting defensive, it's because somebody has done something to us, and so we need to protect ourselves from that other person. You know, we need to defend ourselves from the other person. But what's really going on is we are defending ourselves from fears inside of us that we don't want to feel. So, three big fears that come up all the time are fears about our own significance and our competence and our likability. So, let me give you an example. Say I have some fear about doing this podcast with you today,
Mm,
and then maybe I'm tired and I'm not doing a good job and I'm jet lagged and I'm forgetting things and I'm taking them out of order and it's just not turning out to be a good program. Now that could cause me a lot of discomfort that I'm not competent to do this. So one of the ways that I could reduce the amount of discomfort that I'm feeling is I might start blaming you. I mean,
mm,
after all, you're not asking the right questions and you're not giving me enough time and we're doing this at the wrong time of the day and blah, blah, blah. Now, it might look like I'm defending myself from you or a bad audience or a bad situation. But what I'm really doing is I'm behaving in a way that lets me stay unaware of that fear inside of me.
mm,
So what that means is that if you want to get better at dealing with your defensiveness, you need to let yourself feel that fear because it is always fear based. Always, always,
mm,
always. Now, that's helpful information for us to know if we're sitting across the table from somebody who is being very defensive. It's good for us to know that underneath that defensive behavior is fear. Because if that's the case, and you can dig skillfully enough and deep enough, you might be able to figure out what that fear is about. And if you can make a safer environment for that person will not be behaving defensively.
mm,
Now, this is even more important information for us to know this about ourselves. Know that anytime we're getting defensive, it's because there's some fear there. And most of us are not sufficiently aware of that fear until long after we've gotten defensive, long after we've screwed up the relationship. Because the whole point of a defense system is to help you not feel it. So,
mm,
we stumble into these situations. So, what can be more helpful for most people is to start paying attention to our outward behaviors when we're starting to get defensive, rather than trying to figure out what that fear is right at the beginning. For example, I've learned over the years that when I start getting defensive, oftentimes I start breathing faster. I start talking faster and talking louder, maybe. Sometimes I withdraw into silence. So if I know that that's my typical behavior when I'm starting to get defensive, and then I notice if I'm in a room getting some feedback from people and all of a sudden I'm talking louder and faster and breathing faster, the alarm bells can go off in my head, ding, ding, ding. Hey, Jim, pay attention. You're doing that thing again. You know,
Mm.
then I can say to myself, okay, I'm getting defensive. What can I do about it? You can't do anything about it unless you first notice that you're getting defensive. So that's the first thing you have to do is notice that you're getting defensive. Acknowledge it to yourself because you won't take any other action if you don't. So you start by noticing it. Then what else can you do? Well, there's a strong physiological, biological basis to our defensiveness too. So anything you can do to slow down your physiology. Maybe take a walk around the building, get some fresh air. Maybe go into the restroom and splash some cool water in your face. Just take a break. If you're in the middle of a meeting and you can't get up and leave, it's not appropriate for you to do that. Maybe you can take a few deep centering breaths just to kind of slow down your physiology again. Then what you want to do is you want to disrupt the automatic patterns that you get into when you're getting defensive. For most of us, what happens is part of our brain shuts down. The prefrontal cortex shuts down, and it starts getting tunnel vision. So it looks like we're looking through a telescope at one very tiny issue, and we're losing track with everything else that's going on here. So another thing that can be very helpful is to try to re-engage the rest of your brain. So you're on your full brain power. So you're out of that tunnel vision. You can do that by maybe paying attention to other sounds in the room. I can hear the car going by and there's a helicopter up there and I hear my computer humming and I can hear the chair squeaking, that kind of stuff. Maybe look around the room and seeing how many different colors you can see. Anything to re-engage your brain. Then it's helpful if you can try and figure out what the fear is underneath there. Well, I'm not going to look good here, or people are going to think I'm stupid or I'm incompetent, that kind of stuff. That's oftentimes that can be difficult. So sometimes, if you can't do that in the moment, we encourage people to come back to it later on, right? But then we encourage each person to come up with some kind of an action plan every time they see their outward behavior there. So first they spot their outward behavior. And when we have a list of like 50 different signs of defensiveness to tip them off, in fact, I'll read some of them, like high charge of energy in the body, sudden drop in IQ, wanting the last word, flooding with information to prove a point, withdrawal into deadly silence, all or nothing thinking, obsessive thinking, blaming or shaming, attacking all the time, or maybe doing exactly the opposite, being too nice, being conflict avoidant. So you spot those patterns. You got to be on the lookout for what your behaviors are. You spot them. You try to slow down your physiology. Check out what the stories are, what your thinking is. If you're going into a meeting with the little dialogue up in your mind going, the self-talk going on, saying something like, this is terrible, I'm going to look like a fool, they're going to think I'm an idiot. Try to turn that into something a little less poisonous. Then we encourage everyone to come up with their own personalized action plan that's designed to counter the impact of their signs of defensiveness. So if your sign is high charge of energy in the body, maybe you take 3 deep breaths. If it's a sudden drop in IQ, maybe you go hide in the bathroom for 5 minutes and let your brain catch up with the rest of your body. If it's fast breathing, slow down your breathing. If it's obsessive thinking, maybe get some kind of an image of you being a gerbil on a wheel and stepping off the wheel, or write down what you're obsessing about and make an appointment with yourself to come back to it and deal with it later on. So there's lots of different things, action steps that you can take depending upon whatever your particular type of defensiveness looks like. So you implement that. And then after you've done that, we encourage people, let it go and move on. It's never in your best interest to keep beating yourself up because you get defensive. And gradually over time, if people start noticing how they behave when they get defensive, they start implementing their action plan right away. They do those other things. It can really make a difference how they react. It slows down their reactivity when they're with someone else when they're starting to get defensive. Now, ultimately, they're not going to be able to get rid of that particular defensiveness issue until they face the fear that's underneath there, either the fear of not looking good or, being competent or whatever it might be, not being important enough. They have to deal with that in order to do that. But the other stuff is sort of like first aid to get you through the situation, get you through the meeting. But if you can do that, it makes a big difference to your ability to work effectively with other people.
I love that. And it made me think of I used to practice yoga with this online program. And in one of the classes, the teacher would always say, the greatest gift you can give yourself is observation. And
Yeah.
that saying really stuck with me. So often, and we all have these things, right? That we notice little things that we want to evolve or that we're not feeling good about, or there's some kind of friction, whether it's defensiveness or something else.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's so nice also that what you're sharing around, just start from observation. Give yourself that moment of paying attention to what you actually do. And maybe that's sometimes a process, not just
Yep.
one day or an hour. It's maybe a week or a few weeks. And just kind of tying back to the research you were talking about, because I've heard a few different versions of that.
Yeah.
Exactly that. Just pay attention to what is happening, what you're feeling. Are you feeling tense or open? Are you feeling, avoidant or defensive, or what's going on? I like the theme of observation. It's such an important thing.
And the key to that is to do it without judgments or self-criticism too.
Mm,
With a charitable mind, with a sense of curiosity. I notice that I'm really feeling uptight right at the moment. Now what has triggered that? I wonder what that's about. Or wow, I noticed that I felt this way every time I come to this particular meeting about this particular issue. What's going on there for me? If people can get curious anytime they have a strong reaction about anything,
mm,
about what that's reaction, what's my contribution here? Why am I feeling that? It just opens up a whole nother world of way of behaving there. So
mm.
yeah, I agree with you that observation is very important.
It's really interesting also because, and I'm curious maybe what's been your observations throughout all the years of teaching this, because I find also the more curious you get about yourself, the less assumptions you make about other people. Because often when you're in this space of defensiveness, and then you're also making assumptions to people outside of you,
Yeah.
he or she's doing this because this and that,
Yeah.
and you're also not giving them the grace of going, hey, what's going on with you? Why is that
Well,
happening with you?
yeah, when we are defensive, we are fabulous at projecting. And we see the issues that we're dealing with out there in the world with everybody, and we project it outward. It's like if I'm feeling angry, everybody in the world is angry. If I'm feeling fearful, these are all people are so fearful, out there too. So we project it out there. So yeah, if you can deal with your own stuff, it makes it so much easier for you to be less judgmental towards other people, to get
Mm,
curious. Wow, that person is really having a strong reaction. I wonder what that's about. I wonder if I did something to trigger them. I wonder what I can do to help them
mm,
without, without whipping yourself over it or taking it
mm,
on as your problem, but still having that awareness.
mm. Yeah, and that also ties back to one of the other things that you mentioned, which is that openness. And in my mind, I was also, my head was ticking away towards also thinking about that. You're talking about conflict and friction, and so many studies and so much data also points to this very same thing, that good teamwork and good leadership knows how to not just deal with conflict and friction, and knows how to turn it into something better, to kind of transform it into opportunity or transform it into creativity. Because when you look at on the creative side, very rarely can you create anything without friction.
Yeah.
There
Yeah.
needs to be friction, otherwise there is no advancement. There needs to be some kind of dynamic, otherwise you don't go anywhere.
Yeah.
So there is also that I thought about, which is kind of the sadness of really when we're avoiding friction, we're avoiding conflict or what we perceive as conflict, they're really, really kind of putting a lid on a lot of really positive ripples.
We have found that environments that are high in conflict, that are very adversarial, or environments that are very conflict avoidant, it can go in either direction, are terrible at creativity. Because if anytime you try something new and it fails, you worry about losing your job, you're going to stop trying new things because it doesn't feel safe enough to do that, So in order to have an environment where people feel safe enough, they have to be able to try out new things and fail and not worry about losing their job. The attitude should be, what can we learn from that? Rather than who are we going to blame? A great example of this is I've taught at NASA for 20 years or so, off and on. And I was invited to sit in on what they called a lessons learned meeting after the last shuttle disaster. And we heard a lot of comments from people saying, here at NASA, we say safety is number one. It's the most important thing. Safety, safety, safety. And we drill it into everybody's head. In fact, at NASA, you can't go more than 50 feet without seeing a safety poster someplace. But we also heard comments from people saying, have you ever noticed that if you're a rising star at NASA and you take a job in the safety department, it's a career killer? So we're saying one thing, but we're doing something else. So how do we get the best and the brightest folks here at NASA to take those jobs in the safety department and then reward them for doing that? So they weren't looking for who to blame. They were looking for what can we do about it? How can we encourage that more? And I think as a result of that kind of an attitude, NASA is clearly the most creative organization that I've ever worked with. They have that as a good attitude. It makes a difference.
Yeah. Another thing I'm curious about is the thing I always heard about when we were talking about radical collaboration in my old workplace. It was red zone, pink zone, and green zones.
The red zone is a more adversarial environment. People are more hostile. They're more conflicted. There's more fighting going on, more arguments going on. The pink zone is exactly the opposite of that. It's conflict avoidant, where if there's going to be any aggression, it's passive aggressive. In a red zone environment, if you're going to get stabbed, you're going to get stabbed in the chest. In a pink zone environment, if you get stabbed, you'll be stabbed in the back. There's more triangulating going on in a pink zone organization. It's if I have a problem with you, I don't come talk to you about it. I go talk to them about you. And we have this triangle going on here. And it's these red zone and pink zone environments that are just terribly ineffective, as opposed to a more collaborative green zone. So much of our efforts have been to help both red zone and pink zone organizations move towards the green zone. Now, people in the red zone, oftentimes when we say, you need to tone it down a little bit, you need to be paying more attention to other people, you need to move towards that green zone, what they're afraid we're encouraging them to do is become more pink zone. And they see the red zone people see the pink zone people as being a bunch of wusses. And when we go to the pink zone people and we say, you got to step up your game a little bit, pump it up a little bit. You need to be more aware of what your own interests are. You need to speak up more, that kind of stuff. What they fear is that we're telling them to be more red zone, to be turned into a bully. So they're fearful to move in that direction. But really, the pink zone people, they've got to speak up, be more direct, more assertive. The red zone people need to pay more attention to what's going on with the other people, But it's an easy way to identify a culture. And there are a lot of implications for it. The red zone is a more hostile culture. It's easy to spot. Pink zone is difficult to spot because it
Mm.
looks very nice. It
Yeah, it's
looks,
subtle.
yeah, it looks, in fact, for years, we just talked about red zone and pink zone. And then we started
Mm.
hearing a lot of people say, well, we're obviously in the green zone, this more collaborative environment, because we never fight.
Yeah.
If there's a problem, I just keep my mouth shut. I keep my eyes down and my mouth shut. And they were assuming that this absence of outright warfare was evidence of effective collaboration, and it's
Mm.
not. It's simply a lighter shade of the red zone.
Mm.
Which so that's how we ended up calling it the pink zone.
Yeah.
But it can be just as damaging. I mean,
Mm.
my favorite pink zone story. Uh, this is a story about my in-laws, and they gave me permission to tell the story. They're both dead now, so I can I can say it, but they did give me permission ahead of time. My mother-in-law, well, no, my father-in-law was a professional athlete, and when he was younger, he was fairly abusive, aggressive and abusive, and because he was an athlete, he was always getting leg cramps, and so my mother-in-law, she would wait. She would never be direct with him about this, but she would wait until they would go to bed and he would fall asleep. And then she would haul off and kick him in the leg as hard as she could. And then he'd grab his leg and she'd grab it too. And she'd, oh, honey, are you having a cramp here? Let me rub your leg for you. So it looked like, oh, so sweet, but it was really damaging to the relationship, what was going on there, because she didn't have the ability to speak up and do that. So
Mm.
she did it through this passive aggressive. These passive aggressive conflict avoidant organizations are very difficult to deal with
Mm.
because people won't speak up. Everybody's playing nicey with each other, and you go into a meeting and everybody's going, "Oh, okay, yeah, we could do that, And then when they leave, guess what happens? Absolutely nothing. You know.
Mm.
Now it turns out that about 80% of the organizations and people and organizations that I'm dealing with these days self-identify as a pink zone organization. It
Wow.
is, and there's been a lot of other research that supports that too. But it has, I think, easily become the predominant culture in organizations today, a conflict
Mm.
avoidant culture, and it's hard to get past that if people are fearful.
Mm.
Oftentimes, pink zone environments are created by red zone managers.
Mm.
And so companies sometimes then, well, they'll change the manager. And then they wonder, well, how come we still have pink zone employees here? They're still operating the pink zone. Well, it's because it takes a long time to build that trust back up. It's easy
Mm.
to destroy very quickly, but it takes a long time to build it up. So these employees are just sort of waiting for the shoe to drop from the next
Mm.
manager that comes in. You could have a good manager who's very collaborative, very supportive, and it takes a while to build that up. So, it's not easy to turn something like that around. It's difficult to work with organizations in the pink zone, and that's where most of them are.
Mm. I'm also curious. We talked a lot about the individual, of course, and the accountability that we need to have and the awareness that we need to have as individuals. And then, as you're saying, we're also in this collective corporate setting.
Mm-hmm.
The companies who succeed in moving themselves out of red or pink zone, maybe not every team, but as
Yeah.
more as a general rule, what do they do? How do they operate? How do they support their people? What does that look like?
Well, first and foremost, they have the right attitude. Second, they get their people trained
Mm.
because no one learns this stuff in school. I mean, now in most MBA programs or graduate schools, the work that they're doing is team based. A lot of that
Mm.
stuff. If you're getting an MBA now, you're going to be working on teams, but people aren't taught how to be on a team. You don't get that in high school. You don't get that in college. You don't get it in graduate school. They assume that you're going to pick that stuff up. So what that means is that training their employees to solve problems and have the right kind of attitude falls on the organization. So first of all, they have to identify where they are, because if you don't know where you are, it's going to be hard for you to figure out, how to get where you want to go. So they have to identify what kind of a culture they have. And we have different ways of doing that. We've got a culture survey that can talk about how skillful they are, and then they need to give people these skills that we're talking about, these 5 skills. And there's lots of ways of doing that. And some organizations are very good at some of them and not good at, so you can, target them. And if you have people that might have the right attitude, but they're terrible at negotiating, you give them some negotiating skills. If they know how to do some negotiations, but they have a bad attitude, then maybe you need to take a look at some self-awareness stuff and focus on their defensiveness and focus on what their attitude is and look at how that's playing out. So it's recognizing the situation that they're in, recognizing where the employees are, where the employees need to be in order to be effective, and then take a look at the gap between where they are and where they need to be and figure out what's the best way to close that gap. And usually it's through a combination of training and awareness and talking about it, bringing it to everybody's attention that this is an issue. This is an important thing.
It sounds like it's also radical responsibility beyond radical collaboration, is actually kind of a common effort from the individual and the company.
Yeah. And when they can do that, they get radical results too. When we wrote the first book, the first edition of the book, this is a long time ago, we called it Radical Collaboration because the level of collaboration that we were advocating at the time really was radical at that time. Now it's a basic survival skill. If an organization can't be good at collaboration, they are not going to be successful over the long term. Now, it wasn't like that 30 years ago. You could still survive. You might not thrive, and being good at collaboration could help you thrive, but you could still survive. But when we had the world economic meltdown a number of years ago, organizations tend to cut to the bone when that happened. And that's when we started seeing the differences in the effectiveness between the organizations where people were good at collaboration and bad at collaboration, because there was no place for people to hide at that point, when they started cutting to the bone, and either they could work together with other people or they couldn't. And so organizations then realized, well, we can't cut anymore. There isn't anything we can do other than try to get our employees to be more effective working together. And that's when we saw this wave of organizations really interested in collaboration. And we were just a little ahead of the curve on that. And so it's become more of a standard within organizations now to take a look at how effective they are at collaboration. But organizations weren't particularly looking at that when we first started doing this a long time ago.
No, I can imagine. I mean, just thinking, I've done scale up in big corporates, and a lot of organizations are very siloed and set up in a way where competence is very isolated from one another. And the movement now is really to have a more holistic approach, a more collaborative approach across departments, towards a common customer, towards a common employee, towards some kind of common user. And it's really, really requiring us to open up our perspectives and reach out. And even in my work life, as much as people desire to collaborate, I've still, encountered a lot of challenges, even getting people to realize that you should be working together. Because we're so used to the boxed-in structures.
Yeah, and a lot of times it requires more than working with the individual. It requires some of the structure of the organization to change. For example, if you consistently pay salespeople based upon their own individual performance, even though you tell them we want you to work together and help your colleagues on their sales too, but if their bonus is completely dependent upon their own sales, guess where they're going to put their energy? So that means not just paying lip service on your employee evaluation, how well does this person collaborate, but putting some money behind it too. That 40% of your annual bonus will be based upon the feedback of other people about how helpful you are to their success, or something along those lines. Now, if you want to change somebody's behavior, that's going to change their behavior. Telling them to be more collaborative isn't going to do it.
No, and I've also heard some studies that even say don't measure performance so much on an individual basis. Look at teams, because most of us today, with few exceptions, actually have to collaborate in different structures, project teams, your normal teams, in order to get something done. But I understand also the difficulty in that from a corporate perspective, because there are so many structures that we contribute to. So where do you look and where do you start?
Yeah. Well, and you really need to do both, because on most teams, there are some people that are more valuable than others. I've often been on work with negotiating teams, and you could take a third of the people and chop them off, and it wouldn't make any difference at all. So if you're just basing everybody's performance on the outcome of the team, in some situations that would be very effective and could work. But other situations, if the team is being carried by one or two people, then that's not going to work. So you just need to be aware of what the circumstances are.
Yeah, and then I also often think that I like to turn around the perception of a performance review, because I've also been a leader in teams where it's even hard as a leader to build the right context for people to succeed, because different things are unclear. The strategy is unclear, the goals are unclear, the mandates are unclear, and then people can be super competent, but they can't do anything. And so sometimes I also think the inaction or the kind of perceived lack of contribution is also sometimes due to the context not being set up right by the company. And of course, there's always the radical responsibility of the individual to be asking questions and driving it. But often there's that balancing of both sides. So I've seen both, I have to say.
Organizations oftentimes think that they're mobilizing their employees by telling them to do things, and in fact they're paralyzing them, because they haven't given them the structure to work with. They haven't given them clear direction. They haven't given them the goals or the vision, to do what they need to do. So it's that's one of the things that makes creating a green zone environment, a more collaborative environment, so difficult. I mean, it's if you look at the things that are required of our people in leadership roles today, creating a green zone environment and maintaining that is one of the more difficult things that they're asked to do. It takes a lot of attention, consistent attention over time. It takes a lot of skills. It takes a lot of awareness. And so that's why people who are really good at it really thrive too. One of the things that we noticed in California when we first started this project way back in the 80s was in school districts where they went through this training and were able to turn the whole atmosphere and culture around. The superintendents in those school districts, they were like bottle rockets. I mean, they were getting promoted like that, and it was hard to keep track of them, because if they had such success, everybody wanted them. Now in California, you probably cannot. No one would probably ever be selected as a school superintendent if you didn't have some collaborative skills training at some point in your career. If you haven't shown that you can do that. And it's the same with other organizations. If people are really good at it, they're going to be in demand.
Yeah, I think a lot of these skills that you talk about, they come up in a lot of contexts. A lot of the discussions I've had on this podcast, but also many of the contexts that we explore with clients. And one thing that the terminology that I hear a lot of people and that I use myself as well is kind of referring to these skills and this mindset as a muscle that you need to practice. So as you're
Yeah,
saying, it's not just like getting there, you also have to practice it continuously, maintaining it over
yeah,
time.
yeah,
Which is, yeah, it's a different thing. I know when I was younger, I used to be this kind of straight A student. And everyone would always say, "Oh, cool, that's amazing. That's so easy for you." I said, "Guys, you have no idea. Like, it's one thing to get the grade, it's another thing to keep the grade."
yeah,
It's always like it feels easy till you get there, but then when you're up there, you have to stay there. It's a, that's a very different experience
yeah,
from the path there. So
yeah,
the maintenance work is also a huge factor, I think.
yeah. And a lot of people, you're talking about practicing it and practicing the skills. If you're practicing the wrong thing, it's not going to help. I mean,
No.
if you have a bad golf swing and you go out and you do that 10,000 times, you're going to get really good at being bad.
Mm,
So you do need to know what the skills are that you're going to be working
mm,
on in the
mm.
first place, and then you need
Yeah.
to keep that awareness up. And it's
Mm.
hard work.
It is hard work. So the way I usually wrap this up is by kind of boiling it down to some little tips or actions,
Yeah,
because usually we talk about these kind of ideas or conceptual things and we've been pretty practical, but I always like to bring it back to the individual. Like, what can I do, or what can somebody listening do today,
yeah.
tomorrow, to start practicing their collaborative ability?
Well, I would say number one is pay attention to your own attitude.
Mm,
Notice if you're feeling conflict avoidant or
mm,
adversarial or collaborative.
mm,
Notice if you have a red zone or a pink zone or a green zone attitude yourself, because that's going to make a difference. And
mm,
if you notice that you're in the red zone or the pink zone, get curious about it. Try and figure out what that's about. So that would be the number one thing. Second thing, pay a lot more attention to your own defensiveness. What's the underlying fear that's driving you into being defensive? Pay attention to that. Be on the lookout for your signs of defensiveness and come up with some action plan to try and moderate the damage of that, and then practice that. And
mm,
then the third thing is anytime you have any differences that you need to resolve, um, I encourage you to do that in a way that supports the relationship rather than undermines the relationship.
mm,
We didn't talk much about the negotiating skills, that fifth skill, but it's an important one. And typically, when most of us try to resolve a conflict now, or we're going into negotiations, we try to understand the situation from our point of view. We come up with our favorite solution. We go to the other party. We try to convince them that our favorite solution is better than their favorite solution. And then through trade offs or compromises, we try to come up with something that we can both live with. And I've seen this in every type of negotiation you can think of, from the United Nations down to a family trying to figure out where to go on vacation. What we're suggesting people should do is spend less energy in the beginning trying to find solutions, coming up with their own favorite solution or their own positions, and spend more time trying to understand what the underlying needs are for all the parties.
mm,
Because you have a much greater chance of reaching some kind of an agreement if both parties really truly understand all of the underlying interests and the needs of the other party, even if they disagree with them, if they understand them. And a lot of times we don't take the energy, put in the time and the energy to try and figure out what the other side needs. So if you can do
mm,
that, anytime you have differences, you know, pay attention to your attitude, try not to get defensive, focus what the underlying needs are of all the parties before you start looking for solutions.
mm.
You're going to be, miles ahead of the game, I
I
think, if you
love
can do
that.
those things.
We talk about spending time with a problem in our work. It's something that we see again and again, how when something happens, we
Yeah,
just start throwing solutions at it.
yeah,
We have actually no idea what the problem is. We don't know what the root cause is. We don't know anything. We just
yeah,
throw solutions and hope for the best.
yeah,
So that's is very similar strategy that we have in design work, which is really kind of saying, hey, let's stop here,
right.
listen, and agree. And it also reminded me of a conversation I've had with Eva Humboldt, who is working on a different type of feedback model.
Mm.
And she would like feedback to be more of a meaningful conversation. And
Mm-hmm.
so what she talks about is that feedback can send us into defense because it's an act of judgment. And
Mm-hmm.
so it can be a very threatening thing to
Yeah.
receive and
Yeah.
even to give. But then what she talks about is very similar to what you're saying, is if you're having a meaningful conversation, it's first about grounding in some kind of common goal, even if that common goal is the single person's growth or something else. Then, really, okay, aligning on what are we seeing and where
Mm-hmm.
are we wanting to go. And then that kind of makes it meaningful for both parties and also easier to reason around why and how I might be contributing in a good or less good way to this.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so there's a lot of perspective, and I see it both in design and what I hear from neurology as well is kind of very much similar to the negotiation that you're bringing up here.
Yeah, I like that. One of the things that I found really helpful in mediation is working when I work with the parties individually. Is I try to get each person to be able to articulate the other side's interest and position to the
Mm.
satisfaction of the other side.
Mm.
Now, a lot of times people are really hesitant to do that for fear it sends a message to the other side that they agree with them. But it isn't that you're looking for agreement there. You're just looking for understanding. And if you
Mm.
really understand what's going on there, you just dramatically improve your chances of finding a solution. Because usually,
Mm.
if you really understand what the interests are, there's lots of different ways of satisfying an interest, but you have
Mm.
to really understand it first. So that's a key part of the solution there.
Yeah. As you say, there can be many solutions, but
Right.
but you have to first know what you're solving.
That's right. That's right.
Mm. I love that. Thank you for adding that flavor in because we didn't touch upon it, but the super, super important point. And yeah, I really appreciate your generous sharing. It was great having you on.
Oh, thank you very much. I love to have the opportunity to talk about this stuff. It's been an important part of my life for 50 years, and so I'm pretty passionate about it, and I welcome the opportunity to share it.
It's a great thing to be sharing these days, for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to The Experienced Designers. I hope this episode brought you some new insight and some new topics to stop and wonder about. Special thanks to Jim for bringing his passion, experiences, and actionable tips. And don't forget to click subscribe, and as always, get in touch with any questions or suggestions. That's how better experiences are built.